Power is not taken. It is constructed. Not from noise, not from the desperate performance of strength, not from the man who announces himself loudest in every room he enters, but from something far colder, far more precise, and far more devastating to those who have never encountered it. It is constructed from the architecture of restraint, from the weaponization of silence, from the calculated patience of a mind that has already seen 3 moves ahead, while everyone else is still reacting to the last one. Machiavelli did not write philosophy. He wrote engineering, the engineering of power. And his core law, that the man who controls what others see about him controls what others do around him, is not a 16th century relic. It is the most functional operating principle available to any human being navigating the social, professional, and personal terrain of the world as it actually exists, not as we were taught it should work. The Prince was not a guide for tyrants. It was a field manual for realists, and Machiavelli's central truth, that effective men do not perform strength, they construct it quietly, systematically, and without the need for an audience, remains as precise today as it was in 1513. What follows is not inspiration. It is not motivation. It is not the comfortable version of this information that has been softened for mass consumption. What follows are 7 specific, research-verified, psychologically grounded Machiavellian strategies that separate the men who are managed by their environments from the men who architect them. Stay with this until the end, because the final 3 stages are where the real construction mechanics are revealed, and most people who teach this material never go that deep. Now, before we go any further, if this content speaks to something you have been looking for, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next, because this channel goes places most content refuses to go. And here is something that genuinely matters to this community. Drop your location and the time you are watching this in the comments right now. Whether it is 2 in the afternoon in London, midnight in Toronto, early morning in Sydney, or a quiet Sunday in Dallas, because knowing that this reaches people across every corner of the world, at every hour they choose to invest in themselves, is one of the most powerful things about what is being built here. This content belongs to the people who find it, no matter where they are. Now let us go deep. Here is the first and most violated law of power that Machiavelli understood better than any man of his era, and that modern behavioral psychology has since confirmed with clinical precision across hundreds of studies. Silence, deployed strategically, is not the absence of power. It is the fullest possible expression of it. The man who speaks only when his words carry weight has constructed something that the perpetually vocal man destroys before he even builds it. He has constructed mystery. He has constructed the perception of depth. He has constructed the psychological architecture that makes every room he enters recalibrate itself around his presence rather than his volume. Machiavelli understood centuries before the modern world admitted it, that the prince who speaks constantly reveals his mind, and the prince who reveals his mind surrenders his leverage. The vulgar crowd, as Machiavelli observed with absolute clinical accuracy, is always taken by appearances and by what is loudly performed, which means the man who performs confidence, who performs authority, who fills every silence with declarations of his own importance. That man is being read, assessed, and subtly managed by every strategically intelligent person within earshot. He has handed them a map. He has told them exactly what he needs, what he fears, and where the pressure points are. Most men do this every single day without recognizing it. They speak to fill discomfort. They explain themselves when no explanation was requested. They justify decisions that no one questioned. And with every unnecessary word, they are broadcasting a signal, and the wrong people are receiving it. The research published in the Journal of Applied Psychology confirms what Machiavelli declared 5 centuries ago, that strategic silence during high-stakes interactions promotes sharper insight, clearer decision-making, and a perception of dominance in the observer that no amount of verbal assertion can replicate. When silence is comfortable for one person and uncomfortable for the other, the comfortable person holds the frame. This is not philosophy. This is documented psychological mechanics. The person who owns the pace of a conversation, who allows silence to exist without rushing to fill it, is perceived as operating from a position of resource, from a position that does not need the interaction to resolve quickly because it does not need the interaction at all. You've been in rooms where someone said almost nothing, and yet the entire room oriented toward them. You've been in rooms where someone spoke constantly, and yet disappeared the moment they stopped talking. That contrast is not personality, it is architecture. The quiet man built something, the loud man demolished something. What the quiet man built was the perception that his words, when they came, were worth calculating. And that gap between speaking created a psychological vacuum that everyone around him moved to fill with their own projections, their own interpretations, their own need to figure out what he was thinking. That vacuum is power. That vacuum is exactly what Machiavelli was describing when he wrote about the prince who holds information close and allows others to reveal themselves through their own urgency to be understood. The first Machiavellian strategy is not complicated. It does not require a personality overhaul. It requires a single behavioral discipline. Speak with purpose, or do not speak at all. Not coldness, precision. Not distance, architecture. Not silence as defeat, silence as strategy. The man who masters this becomes immediately unreadable, and the unreadable man is the one no one can outmaneuver because no one can see the move coming. Before the next stage reveals the deeper mechanism behind perception control, the one that determines how the world constructs its image of you before you even open your mouth. Understand that everything that follows is built on this foundation. Silence is not the absence of the game. Silence is the game. If this first strategy already restructured something in how you have been operating, drop in the comments, "My silence is calculated." Because it is about to become exactly that. Everyone sees what you appear to be, and very few experience what you really are. And those few do not dare take a stand against the general opinion. Machiavelli wrote that in The Prince, and it is perhaps the most psychologically precise observation ever made about social dynamics across any era, any culture, any demographic. The common understanding of this principle is that appearances matter. Dress well, carry yourself well, perform competence. That understanding is correct, but it is surface level. And surface-level application of a Machiavellian principle produces surface-level results. The true strategic definition goes far deeper than presentation. The true strategic definition is this: the man who architects the story others tell about him in his absence holds more power than the man who is merely impressive in person. This is the inversion that most people never reach. They invest in how they appear in the room. The Machiavellian invests in how the room talks about him after he leaves. Those are two entirely different projects, and the second one is the one that builds lasting leverage, lasting reputation, and lasting influence across every domain of professional and personal life. What behavioral psychology calls impression management, the strategically intelligent call narrative control. The mechanism is the same. The difference is who uses it consciously. Research from the field of organizational psychology, specifically from studies published through Science Direct examining Machiavellianism and social skill in the workplace, found that individuals with high Machiavellian social intelligence consistently outperform their peers not through raw capability, but through their ability to construct and maintain psychologically suitable impressions across diverse social contexts. The common definition of reputation is what people think of you. The inversion of that definition is what people think of you as a construction project, and you are either the architect or the unwitting laborer on someone else's design. The mastery is this: the man who understands that perception precedes reality in every social and professional interaction will never again leave the narrative of his presence to chance. He controls the information that reaches others. He shapes the context in which his actions are interpreted. He ensures that the story told in his absence serves the position he is building toward, not the position he started from. Consider the mechanics. When someone who holds strategic silence, as described in the first strategy, is also managing the narrative of his reputation, what does the room perceive? They perceive a man of depth, a man with internal worlds that he has chosen not to exhibit, a man whose restraint signals that he has access to resources, intellectual, emotional, professional, that he has not yet deployed. That perception creates deference before a single claim is made. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. Most people only ever encounter the surface of you. The Machiavellian architect ensures that surface communicates exactly what he has decided it should communicate. The mastery of appearances does not mean inauthenticity. It means sovereignty over self-presentation. What others see is a curated truth, real but selectively revealed, deliberately framed, and always in service of the position being constructed. The man who has mastered this does not react defensively to criticism, because criticism only lands on men who have left gaps in their architectural design. He does not explain himself unnecessarily, because explanation dismantles the mystery that gives his silence its weight. What others see is calculated precision. What they call controlled, the powerful call dominance by design. Drop in the comments, "I move with intention, not desperation." Because from this point forward, every move is deliberate. Here is the pattern that has cost you more than almost any other behavioral habit you carry, and it is operating so automatically that most people never identify it as a pattern at all. The pattern is this: when the pressure builds, you move. When the silence gets heavy, you fill it. When the outcome is uncertain, you chase certainty rather than sit in the tension of strategic ambiguity and allow the situation to develop in your favor. That pattern, the compulsion to resolve, to move, to act before the conditions are actually optimal, is the single most reliable mechanism by which strategically inferior people are able to extract concessions, leverage, and outcomes from strategically superior people who could not hold still long enough to let the position complete its work. The root cause beneath this surface problem is urgency addiction. And beneath that, a deeper psychological root, the association of waiting with weakness. You were taught, by culture, by workplace acceleration, by the performative busyness that Western professional environments reward, that speed signals competence and delay signals uncertainty. That association is precisely what the Machiavellian architect has severed from his operating system, because it is the precise association that allows the impatient man to be managed by anyone patient enough to wait him out with disciplined composure. The Stoics built their entire philosophy on one insight, that the space between stimulus and response is where all sovereignty lives, and that the man who has expanded that space beyond what others expect has already won the most important contest available to any human being, not as comfort, as weaponry. Marcus Aurelius commanded an empire with this single operating principle: what is not in my control is not my concern, and what is in my control I will not surrender to the urgency of someone else's timeline. He didn't need an army to enforce it, he needed only himself. And the behavioral outcome was the same outcome that research in modern negotiation theory has confirmed across multiple decades of empirical study. The party that appears most eager is perceived as having the fewest options, and that perception alone shifts leverage. Whether or not that party actually has fewer options is irrelevant. Perception drives behavior, and the patient man's behavior communicates that he has alternatives, that he is willing to walk away, to wait, to allow the current configuration to dissolve if it does not serve his position. The solution principle is not patience as resignation. It is not sitting still and hoping. Strategic patience is the active, disciplined choice to hold a position past the point where urgency is screaming at you to move, because you have calculated that the position will complete its work if you allow it to. Warren Buffett, who built one of the most precisely constructed financial architectures in modern history, described this as waiting for the fat pitch, not swinging at every ball thrown, not performing activity to signal competence, waiting with absolute composure for the alignment of conditions that makes the move not merely good, but inevitable. When you move from that position, you are not reacting to pressure. You are executing a design. The next time someone creates pressure for you to respond, to decide, to commit before you have completed your assessment, hold. Not forever, with purpose. Let the silence sit. Let the urgency be theirs, not yours. What follows that holding will almost always be a revelation of exactly what the other person needs, exactly where they are vulnerable, and exactly how the leverage in the room is actually distributed. But before understanding how the next strategy weaponizes that information, the mechanism most people miss entirely when they attempt to apply Machiavellian patience, understand that patience without information management is incomplete. The fourth strategy is where those two forces combine into something far more powerful than either one alone. Comment below. I play the long game, because that is the only game worth mastering. Pay attention here, because what follows either restructures how you navigate every conversation you have had for the past decade, or it confirms what part of you already suspected, but could never name clearly enough to act on. The behavior pattern is one you have witnessed hundreds of times, possibly performed hundreds of times yourself. Someone enters a conversation, a negotiation, a social dynamic, and they talk. They share context. They explain their position. They disclose their concerns, their timeline, their alternatives, or their lack of them. They answer questions that were not technically asked. They provide background that was not requested. And in doing so, they hand the other person a complete operational blueprint of exactly how to manage them. They have already conducted the other party's intelligence gathering for them, voluntarily, enthusiastically, without a single question being asked. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior is what researchers in social psychology call the disclosure-liking link, the deeply wired human tendency to equate openness with trustworthiness, and trustworthiness with safety. People over-disclose because disclosure historically signaled alliance, and alliance signaled survival. That wiring is real. It is ancient, and it is exploited with routine precision by every strategically intelligent person in every high-stakes environment, from boardrooms in London to negotiating tables in New York, to relationship dynamics in living rooms across the English-speaking world. Dark psychology makes one thing unmistakably clear. The man who volunteers information controls nothing. The man who withholds information strategically controls everything that follows from the moment the other person recognizes the gap and begins trying to fill it. This is not manipulation. This is literacy. The field of dark psychology did not create these patterns. It named them. And in naming them, it gave those who understand them a permanent advantage over those who do not. The reversal of the mechanism is precise. Instead of answering questions fully, the strategically intelligent man answers selectively, providing enough information to maintain the engagement, but withholding the details that would allow the other party to calculate their own leverage. Instead of explaining his reasoning, he states his position. Instead of sharing his alternatives, he allows ambiguity about what those alternatives might be. That ambiguity is not dishonesty, it is architecture. And the architecture creates a negotiating environment where the other person is perpetually operating without the full map, which means every move they make is necessarily more cautious, more conservative, and more favorable to the man who holds the complete picture. What behavioral psychology calls strategic information asymmetry, the powerful call the standard operating condition of every interaction worth having. The new dynamic, when this is mastered, is this. People begin working harder to be understood by you than they work to understand you. They begin filling silences with disclosures of their own, revealing motivations they never intended to share, because the human mind cannot tolerate information asymmetry for long. It compulsively moves to equalize it by offering something. And everything they offer is data. Data about what they need, what they fear, what they are negotiating toward. You receive it. You reveal nothing equivalent, and you use it. What comes next is the part most creators won't teach, because it requires accepting a truth about human nature that comfortable people refuse to hold. The fifth strategy takes everything built so far, silence, perception architecture, strategic patience, information control, and applies it through a mechanism of deliberate withdrawal that most men mistake for avoidance, when it is in fact the most sophisticated leverage instrument available in any human dynamic. If you are still here, you are one of the few this was always meant for. Drop in the comments, "I observe before I move," because that is exactly what separates the strategic mind from the reactive one. The weak pole of this principle looks like this: constant availability, constant responsiveness, constant presence in every dynamic that requests it. driven by the fear that absence will be interpreted as disinterest, weakness, or irrelevance. The man operating from this pole is managed entirely by the expectations of others. His calendar, his attention, his emotional bandwidth, all of it distributed on demand, none of it rationed, none of it protected. He is accessible, and his accessibility has become the mechanism of his own diminishment, because it has trained everyone around him to expect his presence as a given, to assign it no value, and to recognize immediately when it is withdrawn, as a disruption worth reacting to, rather than a communication worth respecting. The strong pole is this: selective, deliberate, psychologically calculated withdrawal, applied not as punishment, not as emotional manipulation, but as the genuine expression of a man who has constructed boundaries not from resentment, but from design. The man at this pole does not respond to every contact immediately. He does not attend every gathering that summons him. He does not make himself available on someone else's urgency schedule when that availability would cost him composure, leverage, or the perception that his presence is a resource rather than a default. His absence is felt. It carries weight. Because his presence carries weight, and the weight of his presence was constructed precisely by the discipline of his withdrawal. The bridge between these two poles is the recognition that availability is perceived value, and perceived value is governed by scarcity. This is not a metaphor. This is documented behavioral economics. The principle of scarcity bias, confirmed across decades of psychological research, which establishes that human beings assign greater value to resources they perceive as limited and less value to resources they perceive as unlimited. The man who is always available is perceived as a resource with unlimited supply. The man who is selectively available is perceived as a resource with managed supply, and managed supply communicates that the resource has inherent worth that must be respected. Sun Tzu's greatest lesson was not about warfare. It was about positioning, about ensuring that when you move from a position that has already done the work of establishing your value before the engagement begins. The battlefield was merely the context. In the terrain of personal and professional dynamics, the equivalent of Sun Tzu's positioning principle is this: the man who has trained others to recognize that his presence is earned, not assumed, enters every interaction already holding the superior position. He is not constructing authority in the room. The room has already constructed it for him through the architecture of his measured availability. On the other side of that bridge, what you become is a man whose withdrawal is a communication so clear it requires no explanation. When he steps back from a dynamic, the other parties immediately recalibrate, because they have learned that his withdrawal precedes either a completed assessment or a completed disengagement, and neither one benefits them if they have not been managing the relationship with the respect it warranted. This is not intimidation. It is consequence mechanics. And consequence mechanics, applied consistently over time, reshape every relationship and every professional dynamic around the genuine operating reality of who holds the leverage, which is always the man who needs the dynamic the least. Drop in the comments, "I choose, I do not chase." Because the man who chooses from a position of constructed leverage never has to chase anything. You have done this. You have walked into a situation carrying every emotion it triggered on your face, in your posture, in the speed of your response, in the tightness of your jaw, and handed the room a complete emotional weather report before a single word was exchanged. You told yourself it was authenticity. It was directness. It was the healthy, adult expression of what you were experiencing. It wasn't. It was exposure. It was the behavioral equivalent of laying your cards face up on the table and then wondering why the other players at the table kept winning. And it has cost you. In negotiations, you did not need to lose. In relationships where the power balance shifted because you revealed your need before you revealed your position. In professional dynamics where the perception of composure would have created leverage that your visible reactivity dismantled in seconds. The reframe is not what popular psychology offers, which is emotional suppression or the performance of false calm. The reframe is precision. The strategically intelligent man does not suppress what he registers. He registers it with absolute clarity. He processes it internally, and he chooses what, if anything, to display, based not on what he is feeling, but on what the display of it would accomplish strategically. That is the distinction between reactive exposure and sovereign composure. One is driven by the emotion, the other uses the recognition of the emotion as information, and withholds its external expression until or unless the expression serves the position. Sun Tzu wrote that all warfare is deception, not in the sense of dishonesty, but in the sense of never allowing your opponent to see your actual strength or weakness until the moment of engagement makes it irrelevant to hide. Not about deception in the moral sense, about misdirection as a strategic instrument. The application to the unreadable man is precise. The man whose emotional state cannot be reliably read by those around him, cannot be psychologically positioned by those around him. He cannot be provoked into revealing vulnerabilities he has not chosen to display. He cannot be pressured through emotional manipulation because emotional manipulation requires a readable target. A man whose buttons are visible, whose reactions are predictable, whose needs are transparent. Strip those away through the cultivation of genuine composure, and the entire toolkit of social pressure becomes inoperable against you. The elevated identity described here is not the man who feels nothing. It is the man who feels everything and displays only what he has decided to display. He is warm when warmth serves. He is cold when cold communicates more precisely. He is enthusiastic when enthusiasm creates the desired energy in a room. He is still when stillness applies the most pressure. Every behavioral display is a choice, not a reaction, and the people who interact with him regularly develop an almost unconscious recognition that they cannot read him reliably, which creates a baseline of caution in how they engage with him, a baseline of respect that emerges directly from the recognition that this man is operating from a level of self-governance they have never encountered in most of the people they know. 3 behavioral directives that construct this identity immediately. First, the next time someone says or does something designed to provoke a reaction from you, hold the reaction for exactly 3 seconds before responding. And in those 3 seconds, ask what response would serve your position rather than your emotion. Second, remove the physical tells, the jaw tension, the forward lean, the crossed arms, the tight grip, because physical tells broadcast the emotional state before words ever confirm it, and the strategically aware observer in the room is reading those tells with precision. Third, execute the composed non-answer, the measured, calm, unhurried acknowledgement of what was said without the defensive explanation, the justification, or the counterattack that signals the provocation landed. The identity declaration available at the end of this stage is not aspirational. It is the declaration of a man who has recognized the mechanism of his own exposure and severed it. Comment below, I am the standard now. Because the man who governs his own reactions sets the standard for every dynamic he enters. The entry-level principle of the long game is already known to most people in its most common expression. Don't burn bridges. Think ahead. Avoid short-term decisions with long-term consequences. That principle is correct. It is also so commonly known that it has lost the sharpness it needs to actually function as a strategic framework, rather than a vague moral suggestion. The deeper implication, which most people never reach because it requires an uncomfortable re-examination of how they have been operating, is this. The man who is making decisions optimized for the next conversation, the next month, the next fiscal quarter, or the next emotional resolution, that man is playing a game that someone else has already designed for short-term extraction. And he is losing it. The darkest application of the long game principle, the one that separates the architect from the player, is the willingness to accept a loss in the present tense, in full knowledge that the loss establishes a position that produces a disproportionate return over the longer arc of the engagement. Machiavelli's strategic observation about this dynamic was clinical and precise. The prince who yields a point today to preserve the relationship that produces 10 points over the following year is not weak. He is calculating with a longer denominator than his opponent. And the man with the longer denominator always wins when the game extends past the horizon his opponent planned for. The men who study history find this principle in operation in every major long-term success: commercial, political, and personal. Napoleon understood it until he forgot it. Lincoln practiced it systematically. Every sustained power structure in recorded history was built by men who played past the immediate outcome. Why do most men never reach this level of strategic execution? Not because they lack intelligence, not because the concept is inaccessible, because the short-term loss registers as pain, and the human nervous system, operating on its ancient survival-oriented wiring, interprets pain as danger and generates an impulse to resolve it immediately. The strategically unformed man follows that impulse and wins the moment while losing the arc. The architect overrides it. He accepts the present discomfort as the price of a position he is building for a horizon the other person has not yet identified. He moves with intention, not with the urgency of emotional resolution. What this looks like when mastered is a man who seems to casual observers to be losing, who seems to be yielding, deferring, absorbing, and who, 18 months later, holds every position he was quietly constructing while everyone else was winning the immediate battles. You have seen this man, in business, in relationships, in the quiet executive who said almost nothing in the board meeting and left holding all the relationships that survived the restructuring, in the man who absorbed the social slight in the room and 3 months later was the only person in that room whose opinion the decision-maker sought. He was not passive, he was building. The difference between passivity and architecture is purpose. One drifts, the other designs. Drop in the comments, strategy before emotion, always. Because the long game only functions for the mind that has severed the urgency addiction and replaced it with a calculation that runs on a longer clock than anyone else in the room. There is a man, and you have met him, who walks into a conversation and says 4 sentences. Those 4 sentences land with more weight than the 40 sentences of the man standing next to him. And the room remembers the 4 sentences when it has forgotten every word of the 40. This is not charisma. This is not natural authority. This is the result of a discipline so specific and so consistently applied that it has become invisible. The discipline of the economy of words, the Machiavellian compression of communication into the minimum number of sentences required to accomplish the maximum strategic objective of the interaction. Every additional word beyond that minimum is a concession. Every explanation that was not requested is a withdrawal from the account of perceived authority. Every clarification that was offered before it was sought is a signal, subtle, registered unconsciously but registered, that the speaker is not certain his words were sufficient without the supplement. The principle extracted from that scenario is this: the weight of a statement is inversely proportional to the number of words used to deliver it. The man who says 3 precise sentences and stops is perceived to hold a position of such internal security that he does not require the buffer of additional context. The man who delivers 3 sentences and then adds 5 more sentences of explanation, nuance, qualification, and preemptive defense of his own position has told the room that he does not fully believe the original 3 sentences were enough, and the room will not believe them either. Machiavelli's field manual made this engineering principle explicit. The prince who over-explains reveals his uncertainty, and the prince who reveals his uncertainty invites its exploitation. The application to the 45-plus man operating in real dynamics, professional presentations, personal confrontations, social environments, is this: before you speak, calculate the minimum number of words required to accomplish what you need the words to accomplish. Then deliver exactly that number and stop. Not fewer, which produces obscurity. Not more, which produces exposure. Exactly that number, delivered with the composed, unhurried cadence of a man who has assessed the interaction and determined that his contribution to it is complete. The silence that follows belongs to him, not to the room. And the room will fill that silence with its own response, which is the response he created space for by compressing his communication to the words that matter and severing the ones that only served his discomfort with unresolved air. A careless tongue loses empires. A disciplined one builds them. This is the principle that the final two stages build everything on top of. Because the 7 strategies are not separate techniques, they are one architecture, and this stage has now revealed the connective tissue between all of them. The economy of words is the behavioral discipline that makes silence credible, appearances sustainable, patience communicable, information control executable, withdrawal meaningful, composure visible, and long game positioning legible. Without it, the other 6 strategies are philosophy. With it, they become daily operational reality. Comment below, my silence is calculated, because from this point, every word you deliver is chosen, not discharged. Here is the declaration that restructures everything built across the previous 8 stages into its sharpest possible application. The final strike, the moment of decisive movement after the long period of quiet construction, is not an act of aggression. It is an act of inevitability. The man who has held silence, managed his appearances, practiced strategic patience, controlled the information diet, deployed selective withdrawal, cultivated composure, played the long game, and compressed his communication, that man does not strike in anger. He does not strike in desperation. He does not strike to prove a point or to win an argument. He moves because the conditions he has been constructing for have finally aligned, and the move is so precisely timed and so clearly positioned that the outcome was determined not at the moment of action, but in the weeks and months of quiet construction that preceded it. Machiavelli understood this with the architectural clarity that made the prince both celebrated and feared. The prince does not need force when he has made force unnecessary through the superior positioning of his preparation. The lion and the fox, Machiavelli's formulation, built from classical sources he had absorbed and synthesized, represent not 2 separate men, but 2 modes available to the single strategic mind. The lion protects from wolves, the fox recognizes traps. The man who integrates both capacities, who understands that most situations require the fox's precision and only the rarest situations require the lion's force, that man almost never needs to apply force because his precision has already resolved the situation before it reached the level where force would be the only remaining instrument. Most men reach for the lion too early. They announce their strength before they have completed their positioning. They confront before they have observed. They move before the moment has been constructed to support the move. The elevated contrast is this. The man who has mastered the final strike mechanics moves so rarely and with such concentrated precision that when he does move, everyone in the room knows intuitively that this was not impulsive, this was not emotional, this was not a reaction. This was the conclusion of a calculation that began long before this moment. And the certainty of that recognition produces a caliber of deference that no aggressive posturing in the world can replicate. People do not resist the inevitable. They accommodate it. And the man who has constructed the inevitable, through silence, perception, patience, information control, withdrawal, composure, long game architecture, and the economy of words, that man has already won before the final move announces itself. The specific mechanics are these. The strike is timed to the moment of maximum leverage, which arrives at the point where the other party has revealed the most information, committed the most resources to the current dynamic, and has the fewest available alternatives. The strike is delivered with minimum words and maximum certainty. No preamble, no qualification, no apology for the precision of the position. The strike is followed by silence, because the silence after a decisive move is its own communication, and the communication is that this conclusion is not a starting point for negotiation. It is the destination that has already been reached. Drop in the comments, I am becoming what most fear to be. Because the man who moves like this is not performing power. He has built it. Every principle in this architecture, the architecture of silence, the mask of appearances, the discipline of strategic patience, the controlled information diet, the leverage of selective withdrawal, the cultivation of the unreadable man, the long game design, the economy of words, and the final strike mechanics. These are not separate ideas. They are not 7 independent techniques to be applied in rotation. They are one system. And the recognition that they are one system is the final transformation available at the end of this construction. Because here is what happens when you apply one of these principles in isolation. The man who executes silence but has not managed his appearances looks mysterious but communicates incompetence. Because the silence without the architectural backing produces a gap that others fill with negative projections, rather than the projection of depth and authority. The man who manages appearances but has not mastered strategic patience builds a strong image and then dismantles it the first time urgency triggers his old reactive patterns. And the dismantling is more damaging than if he had never built the image at all. The man who executes selective withdrawal but has not cultivated composure produces resentment rather than recalibration in the people around him. Because withdrawal without the behavioral backing of sovereign calm reads as emotional withholding rather than strategic positioning. These principles only produce their full and compounding power when they are run as a system. When each one is active, each one is reinforcing the others, and the overall architecture is visible to everyone in the man's environment, even if none of them can name precisely what they are experiencing in his presence. You have done the work that most men refuse to begin. You have stayed through the stages where the material became uncomfortable. You have recognized in each principle the specific patterns in your own history where the absence of this discipline cost you. In negotiations, in relationships, in rooms where you walked in with the right intelligence and the wrong approach and left wondering why the outcomes didn't match your intentions. That recognition is not self-criticism. It is the beginning of the architectural revision. You do not need to mourn the positions you could have held with these tools. You need to build the positions you will hold from this point forward. Machiavelli's engineering was not designed for the powerful. It was designed for the man who understood that power is a construction, not a birthright, and that the construction requires exactly the order of patient, precise, systematically applied discipline that separates the man who endures his circumstances from the man who architects his outcomes. The 45-year-old man, the 50-year-old man, the 60-year-old man who is watching this, he has something the 25-year-old does not. He has the pattern recognition that comes only from living through enough cycles of reactivity and their consequences to know, at the level of the bone, that a different approach is not theoretically superior. It is urgently necessary, and the window for building the version of himself that operates from this architecture is not infinite. The time to begin the construction is not when conditions are perfect. Conditions are never perfect. The time to begin is the moment the blueprint is clear. This is the blueprint. The system is, hold your silence until your words are worth the weight you assign them. Architect the story others tell about you in your absence. Train your nervous system to experience strategic patience as strength rather than failure. Control the flow of information in every high-stakes interaction. Make your presence scarce enough that its withdrawal communicates consequence. Cultivate a composure so genuine and so consistent that those around you cannot find the emotional lever that produces your reactive compliance. Play past the horizon everyone else planned for. Compress every communication to the minimum number of words that accomplishes its maximum strategic objective. And then, when the construction is complete, when the leverage has been built, when the position has been established, move with the certainty of a man who did not react his way to this moment, but designed it. The man who has done this does not need to announce his arrival. Every room announces it for him. Comment below, I govern myself, nothing else governs me. Because that is the declaration of a man who has crossed from the draft to the final version of himself. 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, the man who applied what was in this system will be unrecognizable to the version of himself who began it. Not because his personality changed, not because he performed a new identity that eventually became habit, but because the compounding architecture of these 7 Machiavellian principles, applied consistently and with the precision of a man who has chosen construction over reaction, produces outcomes that no reactive approach could ever generate on its chosen timeline. The professional landscape around him will have shifted, not because the landscape changed, but because his position within it changed. And position determines perception, and perception determines what gets offered. what gets respected, and what gets given. The personal dynamics around him will have recalibrated, because the people in his environment will have recognized, through accumulated experience, that this man cannot be pressured into moving before his movement serves his position, cannot be provoked into revealing what he has chosen not to display, and cannot be managed by urgency that he has permanently deactivated as a decision-making driver. The 5-year version of this man holds rooms without speaking into them. He wins negotiations before they begin. He commands respect that was never demanded and was, therefore, never resisted. The man who didn't apply this will still be where he is now, still filling silences that should belong to him, still explaining decisions that no one questioned, because the discomfort of unexplained authority is more threatening than the discomfort of the silence that holds it, still reacting to the urgencies of other people's timelines because his own patience has not yet been constructed into a discipline he can deploy at will, still moving too early, showing too much, saying too much, and wondering why the outcomes continue to fall short of the intelligence and the effort he is genuinely bringing to his life. The fork in the road is not ahead of him. It was here. It was in the decision to hold these 7 principles as information worth noting, or as a blueprint worth executing. One path leads to the same destination he has been approaching for years. The other leads to the man he has always had the architecture to become. The only question left is not whether this is true. You already know it is. The question is what you do with it now. Begin the construction. Execute the first principle before you close this video. The answer to that question begins today. If this restructured something in you, subscribe, because what follows will go deeper. This is not a channel. This is an evolution system.